Welcome back to our next lecture on music and identity, and we'll be focusing specifically on ethnicity and gender today. It's a big topic. We could have an entire course, like a lot of our lectures in this class, we could have entire courses on music and identity, and so we're giving it a very short overview here in one lecture, but I hope some of the concepts and ideas and theories we talk about in this lecture will kind of be applied throughout the rest of the course. I found many of the best discussions and many of the best kind of thought-provoking class sessions I've ever taught have been around this idea of music and identity. So let's get started. Just a reminder that your final project topic approval is nearly due, and so if you haven't already, please email me or contact me through Canvas and get my approval for your topic. For the most part, if you give me a very vague and general topic that you want to do for your final project, I'll come back with you and say, give me some more narrow, questions or angles you're going to be addressing in your final papers, because I want you guys to narrow down your topic as much as you can right now before you start your research. And so remember, if you haven't thought about your topic yet, go right away and do it, because time is ticking down. Look at the syllabus for the dates. And again, look at the syllabus for the options for your final product. You have a traditional research paper, you have a podcast, a grant proposal, etc. So we need to have something very specific here, or as specific as you can be very soon. And part of your final product grade is dependent on getting my approval for the topic. So get right on that. Again, email me or contact me through Canvas. So we're going to talk about identity, so I wanted to just generally talk very quickly, what is identity? This is like the dictionary definition of identity, which is it's something that kind of makes you an individual person. It's something you identify with. It's your identification, and it's a sameness or oneness that you identify with as a group. So oftentimes when we're talking about identity, it's a marker of, we sometimes talk about it as a marker of difference, but in fact, if you think about it, identity is really not about difference. It's about sameness or individuality or oneness, and that idea of difference is a different way of talking about identity that we should be aware of, I guess, and in our next conversation. Historically, and I hope you read the article by Simon Frith already. It's a very, very good article. It brings up really a lot of important points that I know you'll be able to use in this class and in other classes. But I just wanted to address the idea of music and identity historically. And really, it was understood for a long time as music was reflecting some sort of essential identity of individuals or groups. And we talked about this a little bit in terms of, like in our music and religion lecture, how music was thought to, in the kind of Renaissance and early periods, music was thought to kind of reflect or express the power of the church or the power of God. So that's one way music and identity were thought of in the past. And another way was maybe if you think about kind of through the Orientalist lens, how the music of the East, music of the Arabs in India was thought to kind of essentially reflect their essential Orientalist traits of being sensual, of being mystical, of being sexual, etc. And so this is kind of an older way of understanding identity and how its identity is reflected by the music being performed. And Frith talks about a number of other ways, or another way of understanding how identity operates in music performance. Before we get to that though, really the idea from a kind of romantic period was that music, the score of music really kind of reflected something essential. And so this 19th century aesthetics were really kind of objectified all art. And so in objectifying music, especially because it's a temporal art, it doesn't exist all the time, it just exists in a space of time. In objectifying that, 19th century aesthetics attempted to look to the score as the kind of try and understand what the music meant, what was the music reflecting. And so that's why there was kind of a lot of this obsession with understanding and analyzing the score in earlier conceptions of music and aesthetics. And another concept that came about kind of from this early Romantic era was that music wasn't to be wallowed in. It should be appreciated with intellectual detachment and contemplation. So that's why you have this kind of elevation of high art music that was only understood by the intellectual elite, and that this kind of popular music, etc., wasn't really worth understanding. It wasn't worth investigating because it wasn't something that you could appreciate or contemplate. It lacked a score oftentimes. So if you would think about maybe popular music in the 19th century, maybe folk tunes, it wasn't written down, it wasn't some analysis of that score to be objectified, but it was in performance that folk music, etc., happened. And so there was this kind of placing of high art and low art, and for a long time, high art was the only thing really worthy of study. However, that's changed. The idea that high art is the only thing we can study is now, people no longer think that. And I think you got that impression from the article by Simon Frith. And his article, I just want to kind of make 3 points that are important that he brings out in his article that kind of are moves away from the idea that art needs to be objectified and that music and identity are reflected somehow. And Frith is not the first person to discuss or to talk like this or use these kind of concepts, but since we read this article, I'll focus on him. But what he says is that identity is not something to be revealed or discovered, but it's mobile. Identity is a process. It's not a thing. And so rather than maybe older notions of kind of revealing your true identity, there's lots of self-help books out there that kind of want to reveal your true identity. I think we understand now that identity is something that we can try on. It's like almost like clothing. We can try on a certain aspect of our identity. It's not something immutable or essential about us. And so that's an important shift in the way we understand identity and how we express it. Frith also mentions that music allows us to experience the self in process. And what this means is that music being kind of a temporal art in kind of participating in, by listening to music or in participating in making music, you are creating yourself, you're creating your identity in that process. And so this is kind of attempting to kind of go back and say that no, art can't be objectified. We can't just look at the score. We can't just look at the music or what the composer meant this music to be. We have to look at how music is used, how it's in the performance. Things are created in the performance. Identity is created in the performance, and through that performance, we're crafting ourselves. You're experiencing yourself in process of being made. And the third thing is that people get to know themselves as individuals and groups through cultural activities, not as a way of expressing ideas, but as a way of living them. So yes, music expresses certain ideas. We get that. But in terms of kind of a newer way of examining identity, people get to know themselves and they live their identities in the expressive act of making and listening to music, listening to it individually, listening to it as a group, etc. You're actively in process of creating your identity, participating in the musical performance, either by listening or by playing. And again, this is kind of taking on the notion that art is objectified, that we can only understand what music means by looking at what the composer meant it to mean, rather than understanding what music means through the act of performance, which means we have to understand not only what the composer intended and what they're saying, but also what it means to the people that are listening to it, that are participating in it. So it kind of broadens that field of what music means and offers to everyone around. So thus, for an understanding of music and identity, the text or score matters a little bit less than the performance itself. And so there's a shift here going from kind of objectified art to looking at art as performance, and identity not as an objectified essential quality that's immutable in people, but identity as looking at it also as a performance or something we try on or a process that we're continually working through. There's no end to this process, but it's a kind of identity is a process that we're always moving and working through. So what are some of the implications of this idea of identity as a process? I think I've mentioned several of them. that I've already mentioned that the idea that we have a true self or our identity is somehow immutable or essential, that kind of goes out the window because we understand that identity is being created all the time through cultural activities, through music. So this makes essentialisms very difficult to square. So if we understand identity as a self in process, then kind of pinning very essential characteristics on different groups of people becomes very difficult to do. Kind of the Orientalism, pinning kind of all these negative stereotypes on Arabs and on East becomes very difficult. Pinning very essential stereotypes on Africans or African Americans becomes difficult because we understand that there really is no such thing as an essential characteristic, but that identity is a process being continually remade. It also means that that the self and process idea allows for changing tastes. It allows for changing ideologies. It allows for changing identities. And so, like I said, there's nothing fixed about our identity. It's something we're continually remaking. The self and process idea also enables empathetic exchange across boundaries, and this is really important with music. Music is this way, as my last point makes, that individuals can experience the culture of others. They can try on different aspects of their identities. They can try on different identities by listening and participating in different music. And so we're going to talk a lot about, in our later examples, we're going to talk a lot about kind of rap and female identity and African American identity and Filipino American identity. But if we think about just kind of basically when kind of hip hop and rap first came out, the people who were buying all this, the kind of consumers of this music were, white suburban kids. And so in a way, you can think about white suburban kids identifying with rap and enjoying it and purchasing it. They are able to kind of live out, or at least have some kind of empathetic exchange or empathetic trying on of a different culture, a different experience. And so in that way, you can kind of understand how music has this power to enable this experience of other cultures, enable this trying on of different identity clothing that we have. So there's two different ways, I guess, of understanding pop music and identity. The first is, sometimes people talk about how the success of pop music is how truthful that the artist is describing their community or subculture. So if you think, let's say, again, we'll look at kind of early hip hop, early rap, a lot of the success of the albums that were produced by certain artists were kind of ascribed to they really knew it. They lived this life. They lived on the streets. They were slinging drugs, etc. And then they were describing that in a truthful manner. And so the authenticity or the kind of realness of the early hip hop songs were described as, or were understood as, how truthful these artists were being to their roots or to being to their community. And there's a different way of identifying that now. So you can either measure the truthfulness of the artist versus their community. That's one way, but maybe a better way might be identifying how pop music sets up an idea of truth and how it defines its own aesthetic standard. And what does this mean? We'll kind of discuss exactly what this newer way of identifying how aesthetic standards are set in performance and how the idea of truthfulness is set up in performance rather than just kind of ascribing to how truthful the artist is. Again, this is maybe not complicated, but at least a newer way of thinking about identity that we'll go through some examples later on in the lecture that will help understand how artists are setting up the idea of truth in their own performances. They're kind of establishing that aesthetic standard in their performances, and it'll become, I think, clearer to you. So music, as Frith argues, offers this kind of a space without boundaries. It offers a place or a space for people to try on identities, to experience different ways of being. And music offers a space to connect with others and place ourselves within an imagined cultural narrative. So I just talked about the kind of white suburban kids listening to kind of hip hop and rap artists, and kind of that would be them trying on different identities or imagining themselves in a cultural narrative. And so music has this kind of a pretty unique ability to allow this kind of imagining of different cultural narratives, of trying on different identities. And again, we'll see this in some examples here in a second. So I wanted to discuss one of your listening examples, which is Ladies First by Queen Latifah. And what I want you to do is pause this lecture, again, watch the video linked below on Canvas, and then come back to the lecture, and I'll kind of break down some of the things that I noticed in this piece. And but while you're watching the video, take some notes too, so you can write down what you're seeing and what you're hearing, so we can have a kind of a virtual discussion. So pause the video and come back 1 second. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I think it's a really great example of early kind of feminist rap or hip hop that had a lot of great lyrics and images that were helping, like I mentioned, kind of establish an aesthetic standard for this piece, for the way that Queen Latifah wants herself to be portrayed, to be for her kind of identity to be lived in this experience. And so there's a really unique combination of Afrocentric images and music and feminism, and like Queen Latifah emphasizes the importance of women in African American culture and so liberation movements taking across the world. She also stresses the strength of women as mothers and as artists, and connects these in a very empowering way. And so this is a really interesting way of what she's doing as an artist is creating a space for herself to be an empowered female, to be like an empowered ladies first rap artist. But let's break down some of what you saw. So right off the bat, what you saw was Queen Latifah was dressed in a very, not in the typical way you'd see females being portrayed in maybe more contemporary rap. But she's dressed in this kind of military, authoritarian style. Her dress, she wears a lot of colors of red, black, and green, evoking the African National Congress. And again, this is an earlier rap piece. This I think is right off the bat. I'm blanking on the actual date. I think it's 92 or 94. This was put out. But Queen Latifah emphasizes this kind of female or feminist empowerment in her lyrics by not only the way she dresses, but a lot of the images you saw on screen. And so when you kind of, the first images you see is Queen Latifah rapping in front of slides of 4 African American political activists. There's C.J. Walker, Sojourner Truth, Angela Davis, and a young Winnie Mandela. And then later on in the video, you also see images of Harriet Tubman projected behind Queen Latifah. So I wanted to break some of those images down and kind of show how in using these images and rapping in front of them, Latifah is also identifying with certain characteristics, she's creating this identity for herself using certain historical images. And so by kind of starting off with this image of C.J. Walker, C.J. Walker was a millionaire founder of a cosmetics company, and she's kind of a symbol of this female wealth and eventually kind of flamboyant social life. And so I think Queen Latifah is thus suggesting that she's creating this sense of herself as a kind of a sense of, she's promoting her image. She's also comfortable with being this kind of larger than life performer, and by using C.J. Walker, she's reinforcing that. And the second slide that really is shown behind Latifah, the second image of a African American woman, was that of Sojourner Truth. And this is if you remember from your high school history, the former slave and famous speaker back in the kind of Civil War time. But by kind of identifying or portraying Sojourner Truth behind herself, Queen Latifah is really, again, challenging the male authorities by associating herself with truth and emphasizing her own Afrocentric feminist position. So again, if you recall, Sojourner Truth was, went to the Second National Women's Suffrage Convention and really challenged the male ministers who were at that convention, by her, not only her presence as a female, an African American female, but in kind of trying to build the case for a non-sexist, non-racist society. And so by using this, you move from kind of Latifah using a millionaire, lavish lifestyle image of a person behind her, and then Latifah's identifying with that. She's identifying with the importance of challenging male authority, which she's doing throughout the video, again by associating with Sojourner Truth. And then she shows a picture of Angela Davis, who is a person who's written about gender, race, and class. And so again, Latifah is creating this identity for herself, not only as comfortable within the hip-hop rap scene where displaying your wealth and being accepting this kind of lavish lifestyle is the norm, but she's also stressing the importance of gender and class in position, in position within capitalism by identifying Angela Davis, or at least rapping in front of Angela Davis's picture. A lot of the other images you see in the video as well are, again, Queen Latifah dressed in different kind of militaristic style clothing, and she's at one point moving chess pieces around the board and turning them into different figures. She is the authority. She's creating this. This video kind of helps create this image and this identity of her as a rapping authority, as a woman, African American artist authority. There's also some other interesting things going on here too. This is a kind of a debut album for Queen Latifah, and so in the hip hop scene, it's pretty unusual for a lot of collaboration like you saw in this video. So there's a lot of other artists here. There's Money Love, and there's a bunch of other artists that are represented in this video. And that kind of, the inclusion of these other rappers in this video really emphasizes this the kind of image of cooperation and kind of female empowerment by saying ladies first. It's not Queen Latifah first, it's ladies first. And so this is a subtle, the inclusion of all these other artists is just kind of a interesting way of emphasizing this communal and cooperative nature that Queen Latifah is rapping about. And so a lot of her lyrics are emphasizing the kind of power of women, the power of women like being mothers, being sisters, again, and even as Queen Latifah is a queen, and she even says she's more even almost akin to a goddess later on in the lyrics. And so all these things, what she's doing is really, she's creating an image for herself. She is through this performance, she is creating her identity as an empowered Afrocentric feminist female rapper. In contrast to, this is kind of earlier on in the hip hop sphere, but it's still very much in contrast to the other images you'd see from artists at the same time. So let's move on to the next video, which jumping forward through time a little bit, and again try to understand how identity is created in this video. And so we'll discuss Nicki Minaj's Anaconda, and this is a pretty controversial video when it came out. But I want you again to pause this lecture, watch the video, take notes about what you're seeing, and try to understand, again, try to recognize how Minaj might be creating this kind of aesthetic standard in her video, and how she's setting up the truths of her identity in this video and what's going on. So again, make some notes, take a little pause here from this lecture, watch Minaj's Anaconda, and we'll come back and we'll discuss it. So the first thing that was obvious visually was this kind of overt sexuality of Minaj and the kind of females surrounding her, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what opens the video and the song is actually Sir Mix-a-Lot, kind of this opening, the male voice starting off the song. And this is really Minaj's response to Sir Mix-a-Lot's Baby Got Back rap that was earlier. This kind of Minaj's response to the objectification of women. So in Anaconda, Nicki Minaj is kind of glorifying her sexual conquests, and she's celebrating all the riches she's accumulated from these conquests. And so she's inverting this power dynamic that is so prevalent in rap. And so she's taking kind of advantage of her sexuality in terms of using it to her own ends and no means, versus maybe in other rap artists, especially male rap artists, oftentimes females are just used as objects, and they are disposable, indifferent, etc. And so this is a way that Nicki Minaj is inverting this identity, as a female rap artist. She's also kind of creating a space for herself as you know, she's celebrating her curvy body, really, as many of the images are quite striking, but she's celebrating not only her body, but she's again disrupting the image of kind of the slim white beauty and as the kind of pinnacle of beauty in America, and by kind of flaunting her body with pride, Minaj is again flipping that, inverting that, or disrupting that image. And again, another kind of striking scene was the kind of the kitchen scene where Nicki Minaj is, you know, she's again subverting traditional notions of domesticity. She's using the food for her pleasure. She's crushing bananas. She's breaking cucumbers with all the kind of, you know, sexual overtones or phallic kind of images those imply. But what she's doing again is, in a way, she's subverting traditional notions of domesticity in that scene. And in the kind of very beginning of the video, again, throughout the video really, Minaj is shown in kind of erotic situations with other women. And again, this is kind of subversive for an industry that really women are not seen as in erotic situations with themselves, but as objects of the kind of male gaze. And so what she's doing as kind of there are very few queer women of color in the industry, and by kind of foregrounding these images of women by themselves without males for the most part in the video gazing upon them or using them as background, she's again kind of subverting the kind of traditional identification of women as objects. And one of the later scenes in the video, again, it's this very overtly sexual scene where Minaj is giving a lap dance to Drake, and in some ways, if you are looking at it, you can see that, oh, this is another example of kind of objectification of women. But if you look at it with a different example, you can see how Nicki Minaj is really dominating Drake. He's unable to move. He's stuck in the chair while she is in control the whole time. She's in control while Drake sits there powerless. And so throughout this whole video, it's a striking video that caused a lot of controversy. But it really, what I think you're seeing here is Minaj is taking control of the kind of representation of the female other's body. She's kind of, in a way, is subverting a lot of the images that you would see in a kind of traditional rap video. And so she's not only subverting the traditional kind of sexist imagery, but she's also, by kind of using this video as kind of an example of or creating her female empowered or feminist empowered sexuality. She's also following some of the norms in rap and hip hop videos and the kind of identity that the kind of genre creates to seek, this kind of expressing and being very comfortable with opulence and kind of lavish lifestyles, etc. And so this is not only fitting within the genre of hip hop and rap, but it's also challenging a lot of conventions. And I hope you got some of that as you watched it. I also linked below a short interview with Minaj done by Time, and I think you should watch it. It's a couple minutes long, where she discusses kind of how she's taken the reins in her career and, you know, demanded more money from the industry, and really how she can be understood as taking control of her career rather than kind of sitting back and taking what the industry gives her. So that's another insight, I think, interesting insight in how she's attempting to define herself, how she's identifying and kind of creating her personality, creating her identity in these videos, not only visually, but musically as well. So the next video I want to watch is we're jumping back in time to a video by Sarah Jones. This is entitled Euro Revolution. And it's a different take on kind of feminist empowerment in a spoken word piece. This is very different from the Nicki Minaj video previously. It's not a response to it, like I said, as earlier than Minaj's, but it's a different take on crafting an identity, kind of setting up a set of aesthetics that are different. But in the end, I think it's somewhat saying it's giving the same message. So take a pause from this lecture, go watch the Your Revolution video, and come back and we'll kind of discuss some of the things Sarah Jones is referencing in her spoken word piece. So as you mentioned, she mentioned at the beginning of the video, her first kind of reference is to Gil Scott Heron's "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," and in her take is "This revolution will not happen between these thighs." And really, it's Sarah Jones throughout the piece is critiquing, criticizing the rappers of her day and their objectification of women. And so really throughout the piece, she's referencing different rap artists and kind of taking them down through her rhymes. I'll put a link on the Canvas page to a site called genius.com, which is interesting in terms of it'll help you kind of look at each line and kind of see what she's referencing. I don't think we have time to do that here, but in a sense, if we kind of look at this overall, Nicki Minaj was maybe creating her own, or crafting her own identity. She was creating a space for her to explore kind of a female empowered sexuality. And in the same way, Sarah Jones is doing, in a very different way rather, Sarah Jones is crafting a female sexuality in opposition to the kind of the male misogyny of the time. So this is not about kind of flaunting sexuality, but rather kind of denying all of the kind of bombastic things that were said by other artists. But in denying that kind of objectification of women, Sarah Jones is kind of creating this space for her as this figure that kind of is the one who's able to say yes or no. She's the kind of power figure in the spoken word performance. And so, like Minaj, but in a very different way, Sarah Jones is creating a space for her to, as kind of a feminist rap person of power, also like Queen Latifah. And in all three of the previous examples, I think you're seeing kind of this creation of identity in action. So as viewers are able to identify with the artist, you're able to put that kind of take that perspective, that image, that those notions of empowerment, even if it's very overtly sexualized like Minaj, or it's much in more terms of a denial of sexuality or denial of access or availability in terms of Sarah Jones's piece, or in terms of just straight up kind of overall power figure in terms of Queen Latifah's piece. You as a listener are able to kind of identify with certain aspects of that, and in a sense you're able to try on those identities. You're able to put yourself in this kind of imagined cultural narrative. And this is a way that, rather than kind of just simply reflecting some feminist ideology, all three of these examples are ways that these artists are creating a space for you as listeners and for themselves to try on different aspects of a kind of a feminist positive ideology, even though they're coming at it from very different perspectives and have very different ways of portraying that. So the last video I want to discuss is a piece by Rocky Rivera. She's a Filipino American, and her is again a great example of kind of this feminist rap and this creation of identity. And her piece is called Turn You. So like the last examples, pause the lecture, watch her video, take some notes, and come back and we'll kind of deconstruct a little bit of what she's saying. So I think that you watched all these videos and they have very distinct, very different ways of expressing or crafting an identity for the performers. And they also offer different ways for you as listeners to take on that identity clothing. They kind of try that on for a while you're listening, while you're in that performance space. And Rocky Rivera has actually been quoted in a very kind of direct way. The quote she says is, quote, "I feel like I'm creating more space for young women. I'm not just creating it, I'm taking it. I'm pushing people out of the way. I'm willing to be the trailblazer because I know it didn't start with me and it won't end with me. I know that seeing somebody who looks like me up there is a revolutionary act," unquote. And I think that's really telling. I think in terms of our discussion of identity, in terms of not just reflecting something, but actually creating something in the performance. So like Simon Frith was saying in the article, this kind of, rather than reflecting some kind of essential truth about the artist, or about feminism, or whatever it is. These artists are in all of these examples are crafting a space for themselves and for their listeners to try on to that identity, to kind of to create a space for to create a space for us to imagine ourselves in that cultural narrative. I think musically in this video, you really saw kind of a very bold presence, Rocky Rivera's presence lyrically and emotionally. She is really kind of being very upfront in not only her presence, her words, and her kind of speech, but also in terms of her dominance over the camera in many respects, and kind of the way the camera is angled kind of underneath her for a while. A lot of her rap is about kind of breaking free of the kind of narrow ideal of what a femininity is. She'd rather be a pirate, than it would be kind of this stereotypical image of a woman. So it's a liberating idea, more than just kind of an equality, but more of a liberating idea about female empowerment, female enlightenment. I think this is shown both lyrically, like I said, both lyrically and through the visuals of the video. And so I think if you take all four of these examples, even the kind of the Time interview with Nicki Minaj, so 5 examples, you have very different takes on identity, on ethnicity, on gender, very different ways of expressing that. But in the end, what all of these artists are doing are, like I've been saying kind of throughout the lecture, not reflecting an identity, not just expressing some ideal, but actually creating their identity in the process of performance. And so I would really want to hear your thoughts. And so I would encourage you all, I'll put something up on Canvas, a discussion section on Canvas. I want you to discuss as a class what you saw in these videos. So my take is just one take. I think it's informed by Simon Frith, the reading we did, but also I want to hear your take on the different images, the different sounds, the different ways of expressing themselves, and of also creating identity through performance. So I'll put that up on Canvas, and I want to hopefully have a little lively discussion. This is a great way to get some of your participation points by offering some really, I'm sure you all have very insightful comments about each one of these videos. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, this is a whirlwind tour of ethnicity and identity, but I think we touched on some important aspects of identity. To recap, as we've gone through this whirlwind tour, historically music was thought to represent ideologies and identities, and in this sense the score, or what the composer intended, was seen as the most important thing to understand how or what was being represented. So you have all these books on academic courses, etc., about understanding the score and seeing what the composer intended, and that's kind of one way of understanding identity through music. And I think maybe a different way of understanding it, as we've read in our reading, is that identity is mobile and it's a process. And this acknowledges the importance of performance. So not just the score anymore, but it's actually the performance itself in creating a space for the artist and the listeners to exchange, to explore, to participate in an imaginary narrative. And it's also vital that we analyze music for ways in which truth and the aesthetic standards are created in the performance. So not just measuring how artists maybe speak to a subculture or to a community, to kind of measure the effectiveness of their message by saying, oh, they represent this because they have this background, etc., but see musically and visually how these standards are set in the performance itself. So it's a different way of understanding how kind of the authenticity or the kind of the characteristics of identity are being created in the performance. They're not being represented, but they're being created. So thanks for watching this very kind of dense and quick lecture on identity and music, and I really want you to continue this discussion on the discussion board on Canvas. And so I want to read some of your thoughts. I'll try to participate as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about very
striking and I think can be controversial, and also I think really interesting ways of understanding identity, ethnicity, gender, etc. in hip hop videos. Also remember to get your approval, my approval for your research project by in just a couple of days now. So remember to do that, otherwise your final project grade will be knocked down a little bit. So I hope you have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you for the next lecture on the kind of research project A help, which I'll be kind of recounting some ways of research, ways of citation, and then hopefully we have more of time to, again, email back and forth for getting your project approval. Thanks.